All right. Well, welcome everybody. It's great to see so many of you joining here. We're up to 35 at the moment. And if I could just ask you to put your volume on mute at the start, that would be great, because that way whoever's speaking becomes the picture. My name's Stephen Mo. Kia ora koto, ko Stephen toku ingoa no o tatahi ao. E onere he kororia ki te atua he whakaro pa ki ngā tangata katoa, he manga tonga ki te whenua. It's a real pleasure to welcome you once again to another Friday at noon call. It's great to see new faces, and I know quite a few people watch the videos afterwards as well. So I think this is becoming a resource, if nothing else, a record of what we talked about and what we were discussing at this unique point in time. But it's great to see so many of you dialing in and also providing me with feedback on different initiatives that you're hearing about. I think it's a great chance to share and to learn from each other. And that's really the intention here. We represent kind of a cross-sector, across NGOs, charities, community sector, community groups. And I think it's a really good representative group. So thank you very much for joining. So for those of you who haven't been before, what we're going to do is have a few sector updates. I think it's always good to hear from different perspectives. We're using the word bubble a lot, but we often live within our own little bubbles, and we don't sometimes hear about what's going on in related sectors, and particularly in our sort of community NGO charity sector, there's multiple streams of things and thoughts. So I've got two challenging people today who are going to present us some of their thoughts of what's going on. Just before we dive into that, and I'm glad that you're on the call as well, Craig, because there was a call earlier in this week with Minister Poto Williams, and some of us were on that call. So I thought I'd just give a really brief update from my perspective on how that call went and some of the things that she was talking about. And sorry to put you on the spot, Craig, but I'm sure you can withstand it. If you don't mind contributing anything that you think that I've skipped over, or you know, more depth that we can provide to the team, that would be great. So I think that Minister Williams has been reaching out to a number of different people and in the sector. And so there was, I believe, 8 representatives on this particular call, and then a number of staff from DIA and Parliament, etc. And she opened the call. The agenda was really asking, how do we work together in the response? And so I felt like the tone, just to give you a sense, I felt like the tone was quite in line with the letter that we had written a couple of weeks ago now, in terms of, we're not here as a charitable sector or NGO sector asking for something from the government. We actually want to work out how we can collaborate, how we can partner, how we can work together. So it was nice that it was that sort of a tone to the meeting. And basically she was just asking us, what are you seeing? What's your experience on the ground? Where do you see the pressure points? Where do you think that government can have a role to play? And also, and this was probably important to highlight, what are the opportunities here? It's a challenging time, but how can we actually respond in a really positive way? And where is it that we could go with this? So it was a 2-hour call, so I've summarized it in less than 2 minutes, but it was a lot of dialogue back and forth with each of us giving observations from our different perspectives. And I felt like my overall reaction was, it was positive. She said that she felt like the finance minister and prime minister were really open to ideas, to creative thinking of how to resource and to help this particular sector, recognizing the important part that it plays. Towards the end, she said there will be a budget coming out soon. And so she said we would like to reconvene and have another discussion in a couple of weeks once we have a bit more clarity on what's happening there. I did, in the call, I pulled out some of the key parts from the letter that we had written, and in particular talking about some of the approaches overseas for example, in Australia, they had reduced the 30% criteria for charities to 15% to qualify for the wage subsidy, and also talked about some of the creative things like, could we encourage donations by increasing the 33% level to 50% to encourage people to be giving to charities? And she was writing as I was talking, you know, so it seemed like she was open to some of these thoughts. So I'm happy to take questions, but also before I do that, Craig, did you want to comment on anything from your perspective? I appreciate you were there as well, and it'd be great to hear anything that you had to add.
Thanks, Stephen, and kia ora whanau. Yeah, I thought very much like Stephen. It was a very open call. It was really appeared to be genuinely seeking good ideas, but also getting a real pulse on what people were experiencing. Couple of, I guess, key points that were made by various people on the call. One specifically, don't drown people in reporting requirements. You know, we need to be really efficient and effective with this. There was some discussion around taking an impact lens rather than an entity lens. And that came from some, I guess, hard realism discussion around, will every entity survive? So that was interesting. There was some really good suggestions put forward around volunteers and effectively working with volunteers, and some different ideas there. Just one random idea from Sam Johnson, which I thought was really interesting. They were looking at whether there should be sort of incentives for volunteers, especially if volunteers are you know, out of work, in terms of where they can actually provide assistance. And he was looking at his student cohort and floating a concept of what they've found with mental health and well-being is it's fantastic when students are able to regularly check in with people. But what they've also found is that for that to actually make long-term difference, it needs to happen on a regular basis, you know, over once a week, at least for a year type thing, to really actually make a difference. And he was putting forward a concept of, wouldn't it be interesting to credit a small amount of a student loan to help incentivize, which I thought was a really innovative idea coming forward there. There was discussion around fragmentation in the sector. And you know, groups like this were mentioned in terms of things that had informally come together, but also the challenge of you know, a variety of different peak bodies, a variety of different groups within the sector, and the need for more centralized hubs of information, if you like. And that seems to be picked up reasonably well. There was also a discussion of some of the fantastic things that are happening at a local level, and how to keep that going, but also to filter that up to a regional level as well, so that it could be effective and shared across wider regions. So really the whole sharing of ideas. Yeah, those were just some of the observations that I took out of it. But like Stephen, a very useful call, and a very good open sharing of quite different views in some cases.
Yeah, thank you very much, Craig. It's always good to have different perspectives from two people who attended the same meeting. I'm not sure if Roz Rice is on the call, but I think she had a call on the Thursday as well. Roz, if you're on, would you like to share how that went? Or I'll look through the names. If not, the other thing that I observed was something that Sam said about Student Volunteer Army, that they had 2,000 people ready and willing to do something as volunteers, but they only had a capacity for about 500 of them to be actually used. So it was this mismatch where an organization had more volunteers than they had jobs for. And I think that's an interesting dynamic. How can we help to make sure that there's crossover, and particularly if an organization is having to let people go due to financial hardship, but another one desperately needs more people to run the services that they run, and it's expanding, how can we connect those two? I'm still really interested in that little nut to crack. So what I'd like to do, if it's okay, is pass to Ian McInnes, who's the CEO of Tier Fund. And he is leading an interesting initiative from the NGOs as an international NGO perspective. So Ian, I think you said you'd be on the call. If you're there, do you mind unmuting and giving us a little background on the initiative that you're involved in?
Yeah, absolutely, Stephen, and thanks very much for having me on. And look, it's just a pleasure to sit on a call with fellow charities. It is, I think, the first time I've joined the domestic sort of charity sector in any sort of coordination way, which is of course, our shame at our end. So the international NGOs, and you may have caught the press yesterday, 14 international NGOs did request of the government funding to make an early start on the problems of COVID-19 in the poorer world, offshore. Now, we're acutely aware that this, of course, competes with our own domestic need and just a massive stimulus package in New Zealand and all the fantastic work that each of you do. Nonetheless, international aid agencies like World Vision, the one I and the Chief Exec of Tier Fund, Oxfam, and others are sort of staring down the abyss of, we're calling it a slow-moving tsunami. Just they don't have the cases yet in the volume of the West, but in the developing world, the case numbers are building really, really quickly. And you may have seen some of the press about the sort of frightening conditions in refugee camps and in poorer communities where the virus is expected to rip through unless we can contain it. Now, we've used quite strong messaging, suggesting that New Zealand has won the admiration of the world for moving early and doing an incredible job with our team of 5 million of containing the virus here, and now is a chance to provide some leadership globally on that. Again, it's going to compete with domestic need. We're asking for 25 million, not to the NGOs that I've mentioned, but just into the global sort of humanitarian fund. The UN would draw on that, so would international NGOs, to kickstart the global humanitarian response of containing the impact of the virus now. New Zealand also has quite a voice globally at, say, either the IMF or the G20, where it can advocate for dropping debt. That was our second ask. The debt repayments of poor countries globally, about $40 billion in 2020 alone, and they have it within their powers to postpone or drop that debt this year so that those countries can redirect that money into critical health services. And you've got 46 countries in there who spend 4 times more on debt management than they actually do on their own health systems. And so it's crippling. And the third ask of government was that they maintain the aid funding abroad, and they don't change that. And Winston Peters came out yesterday, he's our minister on this, of course, and said he'd already front-footed and had funding being redirected in the Pacific to deal with COVID-19. We said, well, that's wonderful, but that was existing aid money, so we need that as well, and we need this additional funding. Yeah, so just to be clear, it's a pleasure to update you. Aid agencies are pushing hard. It's not about our survival, it's about front-footing COVID-19 in the poorer world. And look, it's just, Stephen, just such a pleasure to join this group and be able to give an update today.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Ian. And part of the beauty of this group is it is really cross-sector, and so it's wonderful to hear these different perspectives because we naturally tend to get a bit siloed, don't we? So this is a chance for us all to hear from each other and hopefully be challenged by what we hear. I've asked Jackie Graham if she would mind talking a little bit about the paper that they've just come out. So this was in the meeting invite. I attached this document. And that's called Please Press Pause. I love the fact that it's 2 pages. It's very short. It gets to the point, and at the top it says, "What are we rushing back to? Please press pause before we lose everything we've discovered together through this crisis." And then it's this fascinating little table of what's our old normal, level 4 normal, and then what the new world would be. So Jackie, if you don't mind unmuting and just explaining a little bit of the context, and we'd love to hear a little bit about this initiative.
Well, kia ora everyone, and thank you, Stephen. Yeah, one thing I've learned I guess I've worked in the sector, in the non-government sector for 30 years. And one thing I've learned with government departments is that they love A3s. So as long as you do a colourful A3 back to back, that's what ministers love and that's what bureaucrats love. So, and that's how it's designed to be. That paper, we're happy for anybody to use it, to cut and paste any parts of it they wish to repackage it as their own. There's no stops on you doing that. So most of the issues that are raised, and please press pause, and anyone who's been in the sector for as long as I have, or even just in the last couple of years, will know that none of those issues are actually new. Well, most of them aren't. In fact, an entire Productivity Commission report outlined exactly those issues, and they had a really good set of recommendations. All of those recommendations have not been realised. But the difference with COVID and the opportunity that we now have before us is that the entire country has been affected. And all of us, including our government employees, have had to work in a new way. So for once, we actually have a shared experience across the whole of New Zealand. And I'm really hoping that shared experience will lead to change, because what we're hearing from government employees is that they're actually enjoying the change as well. So I have long personally argued that the community is an ecosystem, and that it requires fluidity to respond to the everyday question that all of us ask people, and that is, what do you need right now? So, but the system tries to categorize and box and label and control. And yesterday I appeared before the Epidemic Response Committee, and I used the analogy of a garden hose. And I said to them that if you think of a hose and the tap and the water being government, what happens is there's a kink in the hose. And that kink is all the meetings and contracts and audits and tape and control about who we can and can't see under contracts. And all that kink does is stop that funding and those services getting to the front line. So it actually doesn't serve any purpose. So while the government is controlling their risk, and that's exactly what they're doing, the result is that they're stopping the community ecosystem from working to its full potential. And it's only in times like these crises that we see the community ecosystem at its best. So really, this paper is a plea for change, and it's a plea to give the non-government sector the support and the freedom for us to be able to operate at our very, very best. So that's it in essence.
Great. Well, I can recommend the paper. I like I said, I love to keep it to 2 pages is a great thing. And I think this is now, as we're starting to come, I was looking at the calendar and realizing it's May, time is moving on. As we start to emerge into different levels and things, I think this is going to be important for each of us to ask, what do we take with us from the past experience? I know for me, I'm based here in Christchurch, so in the past I've flown a lot to Auckland or Wellington for meetings, and now I'm realizing, well, why was I doing that? Like this connection that we're having right here using Zoom and technology is incredible. Thank you very much. That's really helpful, and it's just good to hear these perspectives from different initiatives, because I think we can each then be empowered to continue with what we're doing as well. So Roz, I know you've now joined the call. Do you mind giving us a brief update on your meeting that I think you had yesterday as well?
Sorry. This is a meeting with Potter Williams?
Yes. And just so you know, I know you joined after, but Craig and I gave an update on our version of that meeting that was held on Tuesday. So yeah.
Basically, it was interesting. It was an hour and a half. Was yours that long?
Yeah, ours was 2. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just sort of looking for some of the info that I wrote down on it, but just off the top of my head, we all shared, everyone that was there shared some of their thoughts. And then she asked us 2 questions, and one was, what is it that government can do better? And the second one, did you get asked that question too, Stephen?
A variation of that, I think, yeah.
And I'm just trying to remember what the second one, I've just walked in the door, folk, so I apologise for not being on the ball, but the second question was similar, slightly different, but along the same lines of what can government do? And there was some really fascinating answers. One of the people who I thought came up with some incredible ideas was David Hanna, who was on our group. And there was a lot of talk about how things need to not go back to being the same. There were also conversations that were very hard to have. I had a really difficult one where I was talking about that the community and voluntary sector are the first responders all the time whenever there's an issue. We're the people who are embedded in community, we're on the ground. But for many, many years, the government's been talking about well-being. We've been delivering it, but we haven't ever been resourced properly. And the lack of resources at the moment is one of the things that's holding a lot of small organisations back and is putting them into threat at the moment. So that was a hard conversation to have directly with the minister, but someone had to say it, so I did. But there a lot of positive conversations about how organisations are actually adapting and looking for things that are different and different ways of meeting the gaps and the needs in communities, and that our very flexibility and our ability to think on our toes and actually our ability to come up with interesting solutions is one of the great positives about having this sector out there working in communities. So that's at the top of my head. I did make notes and I'm happy to sort of transcribe them and send them around. But at the top of my head, it was basically that kind of tonal conversation. And I'm sorry, I had to take my husband down to hospital for his glaucoma, and I've just walked back in the door, so I'm just not quite prepared. But that's my memory.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you, and it kind of echoes what Craig and I were saying as well. So that's good.
Oh, good.
Consistent experience.
Yeah. She did seem to be listening. I have to say, I do feel that she did a lot of listening and not a lot of conversation, and that's always a good sign. But I always really worry because I don't know what Poto can actually do. And the reason I say that is because she's not a minister in cabinet, so it's a real uphill battle for her to talk other ministers into releasing funds for us, or it's an uphill battle for her to talk to cabinet ministers in particular, or the Minister of Finance, about the upcoming budget, about the need to understand what the community and voluntary sector do and what our value is to the greater New Zealand. So I feel it's hard for her, and I do think we probably need to really support her in that story.
Well, thank you. That's helpful. Yeah, I got the same impression. That, yeah, I think anything we can provide, and ideas as well. She seemed really open to ideas and sharing, and she was interested in this group as well. I think as a cross-sector sort of group, she was quite interested that a green shoot had emerged. Craig, did you have something to add?
I just think it's really interesting if you put yourself in a minister's shoes right at the moment. They're getting approaches from all and sundry, and one would imagine that that's pretty much 24/7, even in their casual conversations. And I think it must be exceptionally difficult with the expectation of that, and the reality of a limited ability, and as Roz has mentioned, in terms of, you know, a limited lobbying power of different ministers. So I think it is incumbent on groups like us to try and refine our thoughts and suggestions as much as possible, so that they can be as practical and as implementable or easily implementable as possible. Because so many good ideas never get there because the perfect gets in the way of the good. And I think, you know, sometimes we've got to be happy with 70% and get stuff done.
Yeah, I agree. That's a good word. Thank you. Oh, thanks, Isaac. Okay. I have a visitor, a 4-year-old visitor. So, so Andrew Phillips, I'm just giving you a little warning in case there's something that you wanted to give a perspective from Charity Services. But just while you're thinking, because we hadn't had an email exchange before this, my plan with this, sort of what this is becoming, I've been reflecting a lot over the last month. And I think what I'd like to start doing is asking you to continue to send me the content that you're getting whenever you see something that would be relevant to the wider group, because for whatever reason, this group right now, we've got 48 people. So it's grown quite a lot. And then there's another 100 people on the email list. And I've had a number of people say they appreciate the emails after the calls with the links to the videos and the links to resources and the discussions that we're having. And so I think what I'd like to start doing is probably on a Monday, just collating anything that people have sent me and sending it out to the bigger group, and then sending a link, like we're doing a little invite for Fridays at noon seems to be working. So just to give you a steer, that's sort of my current thinking. So I do welcome any thoughts that you have, or any resources you hear of, any papers that are out there that not all of us would have seen. If you send them to me, I'll make sure to compile them in a logical, neat way, and then send those out at the start of the week. And that way we can kind of keep up to speed in a really cross-sector way. Because the beauty of this group, I think, is that we don't represent just the volunteer organizations, or, you know, the people looking at health, or the NGOs, or the whatevers. So that's kind of my plan. It's evolving. I'm open to suggestions, but let's just keep it going while it's helpful for people. So having said that, the next bit, what I'm going to do is send those who want to stay, and I know a number of you have other calls to go to and things, but what I'll do is send you into breakout rooms, and then you can discuss among yourselves and just talk about what you're experiencing. And then if I can ask one of you to be an appointed group representative to report back. And the key thing is that you get to write some bullet points of what you discussed, because that can then be shared by email with the wider group. But before I do that, Andrew, is there anything that you wanted to give from Charity Services perspective? Any recent updates or things that you're seeing?
Not much this week. Can you hear me first? Because I've got a different, I guess I'm just using headset rather than trying to be a little bit technological there. Very briefly, our newsletter went out this week, so that covers a lot of the stuff from Charity Services perspective, and I'll get you to include a link to that in your update. But we're just talking to NEMA, the National Emergency Management Authority, about what activities will be kind of permitted under level 2, and we know this is really significant for a lot of charities. Helga from Cancer Society contacted me and said street appeals were a really big thing, obviously, as an income source. So if you have any particular kind of like areas of activity that you want some clear guidance on from the government, the person who's putting together that resource has said just, so if you send it through to me, I can flick it on, and so we can compile a really good comprehensive resource when level 2 kicks in for voluntary organizations. So that's my main update. We're also having weekly clinics now, well, possibly weekly, possibly every 2 weeks, but probably on a Thursday. So if any of charities want to talk to a community operations or a charity services staff member, they're welcome to sign up on our website. So just keep an eye on our website and Stephen's email for that.
Perfect. Thank you. That's really helpful. And again, what we'll do, if you can send me any updates, Andrew, that you want me to include in the email, then I'll make sure that that can go out. Yeah, the other thing is that I am recording all these calls, so I'll put a link to that in, I guess it will be Monday when I send this now. And you might know people who would be interested in the content but couldn't attend the call. And that's the use of technology, that we can share it with our teams or other people. So I'm going to send you into these breakout rooms. Maybe the last thing, because I know some of you will drop off, the one other thing is I was involved last Friday in an unconference. So when I send out an email, I'll send some links to that, because we had about 32 different sessions looking at impact and the future. So I'll just make sure that there's a link to that resource when I send out the email on Monday. So when you get in your breakout room, if you can introduce yourselves briefly, and then riffing off of the themes of what we've been covering so far, you can then have a discussion, appoint somebody to report back, and then we can all gather again for a wrap up. I'll just work out how many. I know a number of you had other calls starting, so I'll just give it a second because the numbers are falling. So I think I'll just send you to maybe 5 breakout rooms for those of you. So that'll be about 5 or 6 people. So you need to click join to accept that, and I'll give you 15 minutes and then we can come back. Thanks, everybody. All right, well, you should all be joining back into this main room. So I hope that that's a helpful part of this call. I think the first part is really hearing a little bit about what's going on in the sector from different perspectives. The second half is that talking with each other, having a bit of more personal conversation. And obviously a big Zoom call, it's really hard to do that. So I think the breakout room function really helps us to have those conversations. So now in the call, what I'd love to do is hear back from each of the groups. There was one group that had technical difficulties, so they were testing the limits of Zoom. So we won't hear back from that group, I don't think, but the other groups, if you could just give us a brief overview of what you talked about, and then whoever gives that update, if you don't mind emailing me a bullet point list of some of the things, and I'll make sure to send that out to everybody. So one of you can go now.
Shall I?
Sounds good. Yep.
Okay. We started just having a sort of a feedback, but then we got into a much more general conversation, and there are a couple of things, or a few things came out of it. We were talking about, or one of us was talking about how they're doing a lot of work at the moment on how you transition from a crisis response to the next stage, and the big concern about food and other services just ceasing at a certain point. What's going to happen to people? And so there are concerns about what happens when the help stops, and they're actually trying to get in, working with others, coordinated response to that question. And at that point, I mentioned that I just received today information about how they're making some changes to legislation to enable access to more funding for local authorities who are looking after people who are self-isolating, and that was just announced, I think, today. Has anyone else seen that? So if you like, I'll get the right connection, the link for that, and send it through to you, Stephen. You can share it out. And then we were talking about another survey that just came out, done in the Waikato, about what's been happening to Māori and Māori communities. And I'm happy to share the link to that survey as well. And it's not pretty. Many Māori communities are in a really bad way. And also there's an issue that many Māori communities have not been in the discussions, have not been invited in or shared into the discussions. So I'll share that survey as well, and you can send it out. And we were talking about food parcels going out to Māori communities. It moved into that conversation. and how we know of some in Māori communities who have been asked, are you over 70 or needy? And that kind of question really does not preserve the mana of the people who are needing those help. And brings up the issue that we've all been talking about with our memberships about civil defence. And I thought that it would be really good at some point for them to do a review of civil defence in their processes, because I'm hearing all over the country of some civil defence organisations are fantastic and doing an amazing job, but there are also quite a few who seem quite disconnected from communities and community sector organisations, and who don't quite understand how to work with communities and with people. And it would be good if something that comes out of this is that civil defence learns to sort of upgrade its processes in those kind of areas. And then we went on to talking about how do you preserve the good things that have come out of this. Recovery, and Kate was talking about recovery, resilience and transformation. And that led to 3 call-outs. One is, who's going to keep a channel of all the resources that we're getting at the moment? Or who's going to keep all the resources that we're sharing in a place where we can go to them and access them? So calling out on that one. The second one is, what is the call to action on Jackie's 2-pager, which we thought was fantastic. So what are we going to do about it? It is really good. When we were looking at it, we were most impressed. And we love it. We'd like to see progress. And our final comment from Sue, which I thought was quite appropriate, is it'll be really great if, as we move out and transition out from the crisis to the recovery, wouldn't it be great if both us and government can look at things from new aspects, so they can have a view of us through a new aspect, and we can have a view of them through a new aspect, and we can move on with the learnings from this situation.
Great. That's really good reflections. It's amazing how much you talked about in such a short time period. I'm very impressed. That's great. All right, well, we'll move on to the next group. And Roz, if you don't mind, just bullet points of that so that the others can, and also, as you pointed out, there were a number of resources that you mentioned. I think that flow of information is an important role that we're playing, because I've seen other people putting stuff in newsletters that's being circulated, which is awesome. So the more we get, the better. But maybe the next group.
Hi, yeah, I'm Lisa Foster and I'm with Rare Disorders New Zealand, and our group, we were talking about surveys, and I know there's been quite a lot of surveys that have gone out, but looking at coordinating the surveys, looking at themes that may be coming from those surveys. There's also a current international world survey on people who have vulnerabilities through rare disorders or diseases, and how different countries are managing that and what the implications are internationally for comparisons. A person from Social Link, they're actually looking at the themes through their survey and other surveys and aligning them, and they will send through that resource so that we can share it with everybody. I also talked about my inclusion as within Neurological Alliance, and how we're looking at issues around certain attributes for people who have those vulnerabilities with health. And the theme from that was about funding. We started talking about the funding implications and the possibilities that we would have as a group to have larger entities that work on behalf of a collective. So to reduce, we ended up talking about reducing the back office requirements and the admin requirements, while looking at ways to still provide the need for the people. So really a collaborative approach towards funding without losing our local flavour and not ending up with large kind of organisations taking over, basically. So there was an example given in Tauranga, you know, where there's 4 agencies have come together and formed an alliance, and that they, you know, keep their identity, but they've got this alliance as the main body, which then basically organizes itself through the DHB or whoever to get the income. So with really that would help reduce duplication across the multiple agencies, but still, and collaboration, increase collaboration. So how that actually looks, we didn't get to the very detailed version, but I think there's opportunities to discuss that. There was talk about a national shared platform, the Philanthropic Trust looking at a national shared platform as maybe a model in the future. And some local authorities had been given an increase in funding. I think that was something that was discussed. So I think that's probably most of what we were talking about. And I think just the theme that came through from Jackie Graham around opportunities, connection, collaboration, and what that really is going to look like in the future. You know, the more that we need more detail on how that could actually work.
Yep, that's good. It's nice to see it when themes come out and start being talked about as well. And I think we, in any situation, maybe I'm a half, you know, glass half full person, but we have to look for opportunity. And what does this mean? Can we increase collaboration and move forward in a positive way? So that's really good. All right, so this third group.
Kia ora, Catherine Hall from Alzheimer's New Zealand, and I'm privileged to have taken the notes and be reporting back from our group. We also talked about the financial impact on the sector and the challenge to future sustainability, and in particular picked up the question about what this might mean in terms of the structure of our funding arrangements if we become more and more reliant on government, and what that might mean for our role and theirs, and also noted the impact on council funding and the flow through for that. We reflected on the experience in Christchurch with the various experiences they've had there, and their perspective that things are going to get more and not less challenging as we move through this crisis, and that as a sector we need to be positioned to respond to that. We had quite a long conversation about the impact of our experience recently on volunteering, both in terms of reflecting on the fact that many of our volunteers are in the vulnerable population in one way or another, and so that creates some challenges in terms of their ability to continue as volunteers, and our obligations in terms of providing a safe way for them to do so. Also in the context of volunteering, reflected on the fact that for some volunteers, what this has meant is that the expectations on them have raised significantly, and sometimes perhaps not always appropriately. Also that many of our volunteers, who of course have all been police checked and others, are being used in a really productive way through the emergency responses in local areas, and that was seen as very positive. And there was a question asked about whether what's been happening recently and the opportunities will lead to a renewed interest in volunteering and make it easier for some of us to recruit volunteers in the short term. We followed up the discussion on Jackie's paper by reflecting on the opportunities for us all to evaluate the benefits of the new ways of working that we've been adopting, and what and how to incorporate those, recognising that you know, the shift to online and to a mainly digital kind of focus hasn't pulled in all of our clients, and so there are some equity issues emerging there that we will need to deal with. And we also finished up by reflecting on the fact that as civil society, we are starting to develop in many places quite different relationships with government. And like some of the other groups have reflected on the opportunities that might bring to the future. And I hope that some of those changes, we're able to retain them.
It's really good, thank you. I love hearing back, because I was just sitting here on my own wondering what was being discussed, and it's good to see the diversity of topics that you all covered as well. This is really good. All right, I think we had one more group. Is that right? Is one of you not reported back?
I think Francesca's gone, but I mean, our group. Chris, do you want to speak about your housing? Francesca asked us, you and me, to say something. I was just raising the question about the number of groups that have been involved in this dialogue from the environmental sector, and the apparent absence of those groups, and the value that it would be to make sure that that work that is being done on the green response and the avoidance of business as usual back to what was is important, because you know, we have run out of planets, and the Earth Overshoot Day is the 28th of July or something. So we do have to be careful not to go back into an exploitative relationship with Mother Earth. And I think that's particularly relevant in terms of the way tangata whenua have been treated over the years as well. So I mean, that's a very short summary of what we were sort of discussing.
Yep.
So Chris?
Yeah, and related to that, Chris Claudel with Community Housing Aotearoa, and just mentioning that, you know, along our sister peak to Matapihi, advocating, you know, really for new building design, incorporating green principles, sustainability into the housing response, especially as we look at the number of folks that have been housed that were formerly homeless, and ensuring that we don't return them to homelessness post-COVID.
Mm. Oh, that's good. Thank you, Isaac. Yeah, thank you. Well, that's great. It's good to have these kōreros and have discussions and see, hear a little bit from what each of us are doing. So what I'll do, if any of you spoke, if you didn't speak but you have a resource you know of, if you email it to me, then I can just drop it into another summary. And I've recorded this, so I'll put the link in it again. And I think what I'll do is aim to send it out on Monday morning rather than trying to rush it and get it done this afternoon. Because I think generally when you get an email at 5 on a Friday, you're probably not going to be that focused on it anyway. So I'm going to stop pushing myself under pressure to get these out as quickly as I can. I'll just sit on it and prepare it and send it out. But yeah, thank you all for joining. If anyone has feedback on, for example, the timing, somebody came in before and was saying that they felt like Fridays wasn't a good day to have these, that earlier in the week would be better. I guess from my perspective, Fridays is kind of the last day of the week, and it's actually pretty good for me because it's less, sometimes there's less on a Friday afternoon. So I think I'll probably just keep doing it on a Friday for now, unless lots of you say, no, it should be Tuesday or another day or something. But I also know that many people are not in this call, but they are watching the emails, because I'm getting people saying that this is good, this is important. And one of the things we'll do in a couple of weeks is that IRD has asked if they can present and talk about some of their initiatives. So that would be great if we can join in and help them as well. All right.
Well, I like
have
Friday,
a good weekend.
Stephen.
Yeah.
I like Fridays because it's still semi-formal Friday.
Oh, there we go. Nice.
In fact, I've been dressed like this since 1 o'clock this morning with a global zoo. Here we go. I like Fridays.
Cool. All right.
I think it'd be hard to put another day of the week in, because all of us have got bookings all through the rest of the week.
Yeah.
For other meetings. I just have kept this aside. So yeah, I'll go with it.
That's my feeling too. I'm just expressing, somebody had some other feedback, so I'm trying to recognize it and take it on board if we need to. But cool. Well, thank you everybody, and I hope you do have a good good weekend. Bye.
Thank you.